And we should be live. Let me go ahead and check. And we are, in fact, live. Awesome. All right. Hello, everyone. Ace here. Welcome to the live stream. Today, we're going to be talking, of course, about tanks of the Great War. I'm joined with a special guest for today. Why don't you introduce yourself to everyone?
Oh, my name's Tony. I go by Zer00ption here on YouTube. I was a tanker for 10 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, and I have got some experience with historical tanks, more to the point for this live stream, the Renault FT7. But I've got experience with World War II tanks, all the way up to the Leopard 2A6M.
Excellent. So, yeah, glad to have you on board. Today, of course, for those who don't know, today is September the 15th, which is the anniversary of the first time that tanks were ever used on the field of battle. So I figured, why not do a live stream dedicated to talking about tanks from the Great War? Hence, here we are now. We were going to have another guest, Unatoned. Unfortunately, due to personal issues, he's not going to be able to make it to the stream itself. But I do wish him the best.
Me as well.
Yep. All right. And, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read some of the comments. Jackson says, Tonk. Vadan says, hello. Hello, Vadan. Biggest Dickus says, greetings, everyone. Greetings, Biggest Dickus. So, well, I guess the best way to start would be to, of course, talk about some of the British tanks, since we're going to be covering, well, since they're the ones that, of course, introduced the tank into battle, so why not? So first off, we'll start off with the tanks that actually did see action there, namely the Mark 1. Go ahead and send some pics here. Hopefully they should all show up for you.
Let's see here. Got you up on Discord. Ah, there we are.
So yeah, the very first one here, what we see is a female version of the Mark 1. Now, the way tanks worked, well, actually, I'll let Zero here explain if he wants to.
If it'll load up on me. There we go. Okay, yeah, that's the original Mark 1 with the turning wheels on the back.
Yep.
And that looks like the 37mm Hotchkiss gun.
That's
up on front.
Well, no, that's a female version.
Oh, that's the female?
Yeah, those would have been water-cooled at the time.
Okay. So, yeah. These things were, well, brutal because it took 4 guys to steer it, for starters. 2 guys to operate your transmissions, 1 guy each on your tiller bars because you had transmission for each track. The great thing about this, though, is the British realized right away that the rhomboid shape would be essential for crossing trenches, because you see the same mistake made with several of the French tanks and the only German tank. They had a heavy sloped prow nose and tail, which caused them to ditch out, whereas the Brits saw fit to put the tracks all the way up.
Yeah, that was actually a pretty good design idea for the British. It did, of course, the British seem to have prioritized throughout the war making their tanks able to cross as wide shell holes and trenches as possible. It seems like they specialized in, of course, lengthening them as the war progressed to improve that as well.
And it looks like I was staring at the wrong picture the entire time. I was staring at the gray and white, or the black and white picture.
Oh, yeah, that one is a male. That one's a male, all right. Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay.
But yeah, the one on top is a female version here.
Yeah, that is the female with the Vickers, I believe, is it not?
Yep. Vedan says that picture is the very embodiment of the third wheel. I'm assuming he's talking about the rear steerage wheel, which, if I remember correctly, they removed those fairly quickly because they were found to not be all that helpful.
At all. They were more of a hindrance and caused it to actually get stuck more than anything. They learned very quickly that the de-ditching log was far more effective.
Indeed. One thing I do note that they did have on the female tank here is this cage here. this is to, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is to protect the tank in the event of someone throwing grenades, so the grenade will roll off the cage here, correct?
That is correct. The biggest flaw with the Mark 1 through Mark 4 tank was they were very susceptible to mass grenade attacks, especially if you could get inside the arcs of fire of the turrets.
That does actually bring up something now that you mention it. I've heard a rumor. This seems to be unverified, but it does seem to be plausible. The tanks, well, especially when we get to the Mark V, tend to have, especially the Mark V, tended to have ventilation problems. So a lot of times, correct me if I'm wrong, but there were cases where crew would just leave the top hatch of the tank open, right?
That is also correct because there was no exhaust port. So the engine, which was in the same compartment as the crew, would just be pouring exhaust smoke into it, and it would be basically just fuming out the few rifle ports. So they'd leave the roof open.
So the rumor that I heard with regards to that is apparently the Germans were trained to, later on, once they encountered these tanks, to try to let them pass and then engage the infantry while the tanks had already passed. But it also led to a rumor that occasionally Germans might actually find ways of using the tracks to just pull themselves up onto the tank and then toss the grenade straight into the hatch, which, again, would often be open. That's what I've heard.
I've not heard that myself personally, but I could see how it would be plausible, provided the infantry following behind the tank are pinned down. These things had very narrow arcs of fire, and also very, very slow rates of fire. So you've got two guns, two very large blind spots, and probably one or two infantry riding on top. And it wouldn't take much to get on, and even just take one of the German, I can't remember what the German word for it is, but essentially it's about like 8 grenades all strapped together.
Oh, yeah, the Gebalt Ladung, I believe it is.
Yeah, it's basically large enough to just sit right on the track, and it would just roll up and go. And as you can see there with the large black and white picture there, there's a large area where the engine's got a huge catch area. So where they just toss a grenade in there and disable the tank.
Yeah, from what I understand, the Germans were ended up getting some fairly creative ideas for their anti-tank work, though from what I've read, it seems like indirect fire from artillery was the main killer for tanks from this time.
It was, because the top speed on most of them was 4 kilometers an hour, which is barely above a walk. And the average armor is about 8 millimeters. So even on the casements, on the sponsons here, you're going to get maybe 10 millimeters armor overall with the slope.
Of course, there is, in addition, with the tanks from this time, the armor is riveted, and there isn't really much backing, which means spalling's a problem.
That was correct. They actually had to wear a leather mask with chainmail, and the leather mask had almost like slits in it, what are those sun blindness glasses you see on the old cartoons and show? That was supposed to stop a lot of the spalling. But what they don't tell you is most metal spall is going to be hot enough that you're not going to feel it go through you.
So it causes, would you say it causes basically instant 3rd degrees burns in the specific area?
Yeah, it would cauterize pretty much almost immediately. Like, just for an example, we had one guy on an op who caught one piece of small shrapnel right through his bicep, and he hadn't even known that he was hit until he took his shirt off at the end of the day.
That's a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a surprise. He was just like, well, shit, I took shrapnel. What the hell? Right through his bicep.
Hopefully they were able to treat it, and hopefully he wasn't too badly injured from it.
Oh, no, he was fine. He was pretty much back on patrol the next day.
Ah, well, that's something. Biggest Digga says, weren't the Germans using reverse bullets as anti-tank rounds? They were early on, but it was A, not as effective as they would have liked, and B, the bigger issue is it had a nasty habit of causing the rifle to blow up.
Yeah, there's a reason the rear ends of bullets tend to be flat. You don't want to trap the gas in pockets and deform the bullet, which is going to cause your barrel to blow out.
Mm.
Especially with the older bullets, because they were pretty much just lead and like a thin jacket of copper.
Mm-hmm. Sneeko says, that's crazy, Chad. I'm assuming Sneeko is referring to the guy that took shrapnel and didn't realize it.
Yeah, it's amazing what the human body can endure. It really is.
I have heard stories of guys that got hit and I guess the adrenaline was going, and so they didn't realize they were as badly injured as they thought they were. For example, have you ever watched They Shall Not Grow Old? Which, appropriate given it's a World War I documentary, but it's some of the guys talked about getting hit there and how I believe the exact words were, felt like someone had caned them on the hand, is how they described it in that case.
I do believe that's also how James Doohan from Star Trek described it as well when he got hit on D-Day. But yeah, like it's really different. Like I know one guy who got hit with a piece of shrapnel from a Chinese rocket in his vest, and it dropped him. Like he thought he'd been hit by a bullet, and he wound up just having a giant bruise on his back, luckily, because it caught him in the plate. But it's a very scary experience.
Yeah, that's a very close call. All right, so we have shown 2 of the 3 pics. Let's see what the third one here looks like. This photo, which was actually, if I remember correctly, this is actually a photo from the actual battlefield itself, because, of course, again, you see the tracks the wheels on the back, which the British did in a few months there.
Yeah. The other thing is the Germans were famous for capturing these too and turning them right back around on them.
Yeah, the Germans used more captured British tanks than they used actual tanks of their own design, although we'll be getting to that a little bit.
Yeah. I've got a hate on for the A7.
Well, I can see why. I will say this: if I had to pick a tank that probably did worse, I have one very much in mind that did worse. In fact, I have 2 that come to mind, and we'll be getting to those as well. But yeah, I can see why the A7V is not exactly your favorite.
Yeah.
So now that we've looked at the Mark 1s, I might as well show some interiors of a Mark II, which was fairly similar as design, although there were obviously some changes. But the Mark II was designed as a training tank, but it did end up seeing some very limited combat in 1917. But what we have here, the first pic, is showing where the gearsman would have been stationed near the rear of the tank and how that worked.
Oh, God, that would have sucked.
Yeah.
Like, everything in that tank just screams, like, blunt trauma injury.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems like a good way to put it, all right.
Yeah, oddly enough, it's roomier than modern tanks.
That does seem to be the case. I've noticed that it seems like the sheer size of this tank meant that it seems like the crew on these tanks could actually tended to get lucky on occasion if the tank got knocked out. There were cases where, all right, so what I mean is, for example, one of the sources I read said that one of the first tanks that went in the Battle of Flares was a Mark I that had been knocked out later the day, but none of the crew were injured at all, so they were able to just escape unharmed, all of them.
Mm-hmm. They often, more often than not, suffered from mechanical failure than were taken out by enemy fire.
Well, this one, it does seem like it was actually knocked out by enemy fire, but...
Yeah.
But yes, you are correct. In fact, one of the sources I have here, I'm going to go ahead and send you the link, talks about the first tank battle. Here's the link for you. In fact, here's what it starts with, and I quote, "On 15th September 1916, as the Battle of the Somme raged, the British Army sent tanks into action for the first time. At the Battle of Flares Courcelette, the mysterious new weapon, the Mark I, was unveiled. 49 were earmarked, 32 made it to the start line, and of those, only 18 went into action. So we went from 39 to 18 due to mechanical issues of various types.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah. Biggest Dickus asks, how many crew members were required to fully operate a Mark 1? If I remember correctly, it would usually be about 8, although crew members the numbers of crew could vary depending on which exact tank we're talking about. But in the case of the Mark 1s, it was usually 8, which would be a driver, a commander, 2 gunners, and 2 gearsmen, and then it would be, 2 loaders, which would, in the female version, act as second gunners?
That is correct.
All right. So, yeah, that's yeah. Though, again, sometimes these tanks would go into action either not with that correct number of crew, or sometimes they would actually have to go into action undermanned, which we'll be going through a story where that is actually something that happens to the crew as well, where they have to go in with about 5 men. Although that is later on. JC says, a lot of knocked out tanks were actually just damaged or with mechanical failures and the crew just abandoned them. Also correct. Again, we're going to be getting to that as well. Again.
Yeah, this was a very new technology. Like, it had never been done. So a lot of teething pains is to be expected.
Yep. And speaking of, I think now's a good time to actually go ahead and talk about the first use of the tank in battle. I'm going to go ahead and read it from... The book I'm reading it from is the Mammoth Book of Eyewitness World War I by John E. Lewis, for those of you who want to know the source. Let's see. Here we are. First tanks. Go to the page. All right. So this is from the words of one Bert Cheney of the 7th London Territorial Battalion. All right. The menacing rumble of a tank was heard for the first time in warfare when 36 British Mark 1s were used in an attack on the Somme on 15th of September 1916. The Mark 1 weighed 30 tons and was developed from the agricultural tractor of American engineer Benjamin Holt. Its top speed was 5 miles an hour. Technically, if I remember correctly, they had to actually design a new track system. So the book does have a few minor things, but here's the actual words from Bert Cheney here. We heard strange throbbing noises, and lumbering slowly towards us came 3 huge mechanical monsters, such as we had never seen before. My impression was that they looked ready to topple on their noses, but their tails and 2 little wheels at the back held them down and kept them level. Big metal things they were, with 2 sets of caterpillar wheels that went right around the body. There was a bulge at each side with a door in the bulging part, and machine guns on swivels poked out from either side. The engine, a petrol engine of massive proportions, occupied practically all the inside space. Mounted behind each door was a motorcycle type of saddle seat, and there was just about enough room for the belts of ammunition and the drivers. Instead of going on the German lines, the 3 tanks assigned to us straddled our front line, stopped, and then opened up a murderous machine gun fire, enfilading us left and right. There they sat, squat, monstrous things, noses stuck up in the air, crushing the sides of our trench out of shape with their machine guns swiveling round and firing like mad. Everyone died for cover, except the colonel. He jumped on the top of the parapet, shouting at the top of his voice, "Runner! Runner! Go tell those tanks to stop firing at once! At once, I say!" By now, the enemy fire had risen to a crescendo, but giving no thought to his own personal safety, as he saw the tanks firing on his own men, he ran forward and furiously rained blows with his cane on the side of one of the tanks in an endeavor to attract their attention. Although, what with the sounds of the engines and the firing in such an enclosed space, no one in the tank could hear him. They finally realized they were in the wrong trench and moved on, frightening the Jerrys out of their wits and making them scuttle like frightened rabbits. One of the tanks got caught up on a tree stump and never reached their front line, and a second had its rear steering wheels shot off and could not guide itself. The crew thought it more prudent to stop, so they told us afterwards, rather than to keep on going, as they felt they might go out of control and run on till they reached Berlin. The 3rd tank went on and ran through the flares, flattening everything they thought they should be flattened, pushing down walls and thoroughly enjoying themselves. Our lads coming up behind them, taking over the village or what was left of it, and digging in on the lines prescribed for them before the attack. This was one of the rare occasions when they had passed through enemy fire, and they were enjoying themselves chasing and rounding up the Jerrys, collecting thousands of prisoners and sending them back to our lines escorted only by pioneers armed with shovels. The 4 men in the tank that had got itself hung up dismounted, all in the heat of battle, stretching themselves, scratching their heads, then slowly and deliberately walking round the vehicle, inspecting it from every angle, and appeared to hold a conference among themselves. After standing around for a few minutes, looking somewhat lost, they calmly took out from the inside of the tank a Primus stove, and using the side of the tank as cover from enemy fire, sat down on the ground and made themselves some tea. The battle was over as far as they were concerned. So yeah, that is a first-hand account of the first time tanks were ever used in battle.
I'm pretty sure you just read me something Rage out of Warhammer 40k.
That's actually something I've been told with some of these war stories, but yeah, that
is absolutely unreal.
Yeah.
Oh, that would that ranks up there because apparently Patton used to ride out on the outside of his turret on the FT7s when the Americans were using them, which is just absolutely ludicrously insane to think about now. Like, just the sheer size of the man's testicles to stand out there and just in the middle of machine gun fire, artillery, and everything else on a tiny little tank. There was a different breed of guys back then.
That actually reminds me of another little example now that you've brought it up. There's another book out there. I think it's called 500 Cockney War Stories or something. It's something like that. It's, you'll actually find it on the firstworldwar.com as well, and it does mention some stories like that. There's one, for example, where there was a British infantryman riding on top of one of the tanks, and there was shells going off all over the place, and one of them landed particularly close, and everyone thought the guy had been hit. But no, he was actually fine, so instead what he does is he just leans down to the tank and shouts at the top of his voice, "Hey driver, is there any room for one more? It's raining."
Oh. War does funny things to people's sense of humor. I can attest to that.
Yep. So yeah, that does actually provide a good idea, I think, of how the tanks how they performed in battle on that first day. Did mention that the crew had only 4. I think what might have been going on there, it's possible that, well, with them still under fire, the gunners might have still been in the tank and just kept watch out for the rest of the guys. Or it could be that the gearsmen are... Because, if I remember correctly, gearsmen tended to do double duty as mechanics as well. They might have been trying to get the tank started back up again.
A lot of times, yeah. You get to do double duty in tanks. I know in a modern tank crew, your driver is also your mechanic. Your gunner is also your gunsmith. Loader's also a radio guy and your cook, as well as a spare mechanic. And your commander's busy doing everything else. Everyone's got to do double duty, and well, the Brits were famous for cross-training their troops, so it doesn't surprise me.
A good idea, if anything, especially with vehicles like these, where they were, especially in cases where they were having to go in undermanned as well. So yeah, that is the story. A good example of the stories that you'd see when it comes to tanks, at least at that first battle. But let's go ahead and carry on a little bit more. So the Mark IIs were, like I said, a minor upgrade to the Mark Is and did their bit as well, though they were mostly training tanks. The Mark IIIs were exclusively a training tank and never actually saw combat. But then we get to the most produced tank that the British had, the Mark IV. I'm going to go ahead and show this one off. One of the changes, by the way, for those who might... how familiar are you with the differences between the Mark III or Mark I and Mark IV? Out of curiosity.
Not overly familiar.
Okay.
Like I know there was some marked improvements to the armor, transmissions, clearance, as well as the armaments.
Yes, the armaments were up. The tanks were upgunned. The males all received... This photo actually here looks like it's a Mark V. Whoops. Yeah, this is a Mark V. Whoops, my mistake. All right, so I'll go ahead and remove that for now. But the rest of these are Mark IV and show you. But yeah, the Mark V's, all of the tanks received a front gun that would usually be operated, if I remember correctly, by the tank commander. In addition, the males would receive 2 machine guns on the rear side sponsons. The females, of course, would just retain, because the females already had 2 machine guns on the side sponsons each. They just would retain that. But yeah, that's the big change there for the Mark IVs on the surface. One thing that they are known, one thing that might be missed by a lot of people though, is with regards to the male version. So the Mark I's and Mark II's, you'll note how much longer the main gun is, or the main howitzer, anyways. They found that apparently it was possible for the howitzer barrel to get stuck into the mud because well the tankers are mainly aiming them down because they're aiming at guys in trenches. So they ended up, as a design idea, to saw down the barrels a little bit to rectify that particular issue. Now, granted, this would obviously reduce the muzzle velocity, but at this time, that's not that big of an issue.
No, because you're not facing like any really hardened. It's mostly earthworks and revetments.
And any tanks that these things would face, well, higher explosive rounds should just defeat the armor anyways, because the armor is only really designed for small arms fire.
Yes.
So the one thing I will say that he is correct though, they did up the armor on the Mark IV tanks because the Germans at this point started to use K bullets, which were specialized armored piercing bullets. These are not to be confused with the reverse bullets, but these were specialized bullets to punch through tanks, and they could punch through the sides of some of the earlier Mark tanks, as well as another tank, a French design that we'll be getting into. But it's, so yeah, that's the big change, and it was with the Mark IV that the British saw the first tank-on-tank battle. They're still using, in this case, the 2 gearsman system, so if you look in the interior, at the very bottom there, you'll see how the driver and tank commander had to operate the tank on their end. If I remember correctly, the way it worked is that both the driver and the tank commander had special brakes, but the driver also controlled the throttle. And again, like you said, the gearsmen were in charge of actually turning the tank.
Yeah,
correct?
because they had to apply the brake essentially to the each engine and each transmission, which was how they would turn it.
So, with this in mind... Oh, and another thing, the third picture there shows the tanks being shipped with fascines. These were utilized as special deployable trench crossing tools. Basically, the tank would drop these in front of the tank into the enemy trench so they could cross them, especially much wider trenches as well, because Germans were widening the trenches to make it harder for tanks to cross. So, yeah.
Fun fact, we still use them to this day.
And on that subject of how these tanks were used, I do need to bring up the Battle of Cambrai real quick, which was the largest tank battle in the war. This is a picture I took from one of the other books I've got. It does show the tactics that they would use at Cambrai specifically, where you would have one tank, basically the advanced guard tank would basically smash the wire and then start going up and down the front line trench, shooting at whatever Germans they saw, whereas the second tank and third tank would cross and repeat with the second and third German trenches. That's basically how these operated. So the tanks operate in groups of 3, and that was how they used them tactically.
It was forward thinking at the time.
It was.
The only thing we did now is just upped it to 4 tanks instead of 3.
Yep. So it is pretty. So yeah, understanding, developing a doctrine for these for this new weapon of war was an extremely important thing, and Cambrai is where the British really knocked it out of the park in that regard. Unfortunately, Cambrai, the British didn't really have enough manpower left to really secure all the ground they won, so the Germans counterattacked and retook most of it back, so it ended up being a stalemate, but at least the tanks themselves performed pretty well. Anyway.
If I'm not mistaken, isn't, I believe Cambrai is where they first faced off against the A7s, is it not?
No. The A7s would only really start seeing use during the Spring Offensive in 1918.
Okay.
But on that subject, now's the perfect opportunity to look at the first tank versus tank battle. Although I'm going to have to show another tank design that the British used during the war as well during this point. But here we go, the memoirs. This is from, I believe, the tank commander of the mail tank that engaged the first German tank. So here we go. On April 23rd, 1918, 3 tanks covered in their green camouflage nets were lying hidden in the gas-drenched wood of Sorry, I don't know. Boila-Eb? Is that how you pronounce it?
I don't speak surrender.
I thought you were Canadian.
I'm not that bilingual.
Okay, fair enough. I'm gonna say it's Boila-Eb. There we go. Boila-Eb, near Villers-Bretonneux, waiting the impending German attack. The crews had worn masks for the greater part of the day, and their throats were sore. Their eyes were sore, their throats dry. Darkness came, but it was 2 enemy planes flying low over the tree tops. They dropped very lights that fell in our midst, showing up the bulky outlines of the tanks in vivid relief. We were discovered. An hour later, when clouds hid the moon, 3 huge toad-like forms, grunting and snorting, crept out of the woods to a spot some 100 yards to the rear. Bombardment deluged the woods. I was aroused in the dark by someone shaking me violently. Gas, sir! Gas! I struggled up, half awake, inhaled a foul odor, and quickly slipped on my mask. My eyes were running. I could not see. My breath came with difficulty. I could hear the trees crashing to the ground around me. For a moment, I was stricken with panic. Then suddenly, thought sped through my confused mind. If you are going to die, why not die decently? I listened to that inner voice and pulled myself together, only to discover that I had omitted to attach my nose clip. Holding hands with my section commander and orderly who had aroused us, we groped our way to the open. It was pitch dark, save where, away from the edge of the wood, the rising sun showed blood red. As we stumbled forward, tree trunks, unseen in that infernal gloom, separated our joined hands, and we were tripped up by bushes and brambles. Suddenly a hoarse cry came up from the orderly. "My mouthpiece is broken, sir! Run like hell for the open!" shouted the section commander. There was a gasp, then we heard him crashing away through the undergrowth like a hunted beast. Soon I found my tank covered in its tarpaulin. The small oblong doors were open, but the interior was empty. On the ground, in the wrappings of the tarpaulin, however, I felt something warm and fleshy. It was one of the crew lying full length, wearing his mask, but dazed by gas. Behind the trench, a battery of artillery was blazing away, the gunners in their gas masks feverishly loading and unloading like creatures of a nightmare. Meanwhile, as the shelling grew in intensity, a few wounded men and some stragglers came into sight. The report was depressing. Villers-Bretonneux had been captured, and with it many of our men. The Boche had almost broken through. By this time, 2 of my crew had developed nasty gas symptoms, spitting, coughing, and getting purple in the face. They were led away into the rear, one sprawling limply in a wheelbarrow found in the wood. We waited till an infantry brigadier appeared on the scene with 2 orderlies. He was unaware of the exact position ahead, and accompanied by our section captain and runners, he went forward to investigate. 10 minutes, one of the runners came back, limping badly, hit in the leg. Another 10 minutes, the second returned, his left arm torn by shrapnel. Then, 20 minutes after that, walking unhurt and serene, through the barrage came the brigadier and our captain. The news was grave. We had suffered heavy losses and lost ground, but some infantry were still holding out in the switch line between Cathy Catchy, and Villers-Bretonneux. If this line was overwhelmed, the Boche would obtain possession of the high ground dominating Amiens and would perhaps force us to evacuate that city and drive a wedge between the French and British armies. A serious consultation was held, and the order came. Proceed to Catchy, switch line, and hold it at all costs. We put on our masks once more and plunged like divers into the gas-laden wood. As we strove to crank up, one of the three men turning the huge handle collapsed. We put him against a tree, gave him some tablets of ammonia to sniff, and then, when he did not seem to be coming round, we left him, for time was pressing. One out of a crew of 7, 4 men, red-rimmed, bulging eyes only remained. The 3 tanks, 1 male armed with 2 6-pounder guns and machine guns, and 2 females armed with machine guns only, crawled out of the wood and set off over open ground towards Catchy. Ahead, the German barrage stood like a wall of fire in our path. There was no break in it anywhere. It seemed impossible that we could pass through that deadly area unhit. I decided to attempt a zigzag course, as it somehow seemed safer. Luck was with us. Going at top speed, we went safely through the danger zone and soon reached the Catchy lines. But there was no sign of our infantry. Suddenly, out of the ground, 10 yards away, an infantryman rose, waving his rifle furiously. We stopped. He ran forward and shouted through the flap, "Look out! Jerry Tank's about!" and then as swiftly disappeared into the trench again. I informed the crew, and with great thrill ran through us all. Opening the loophole, I looked out. There, some 300 yards away, a round, squat-looking monster was advancing. Behind it came waves of infantry, and further away to the left and right crawled 2 more of these armed tortoises. We had met our rivals at last. For the first time in history, tank was encountering tank. So, what do you think so far of this story?
That is absolutely unreal. Like to be faced with having to deal with gas and still have to get in one of those old school rickety traps.
Mm-hmm.
And try and roll out.
With half your crew.
Yeah. I couldn't even imagine it. That wouldn't even work in today's battlefield.
And of course, and you were mentioning that, a lot of these guys would have been affected. The gas that it sounds like they were hit with was chlorine, which, are you familiar with the symptoms of being exposed to that in particular?
Well, it's been a lot of years since my NBC course.
Okay.
But I believe it's choking, blindness, and essentially unconsciousness.
Yeah, so what it would essentially do is the gas would react with your eyes and cause your eyelids to swell shut, which is where the blindness comes in. Now, this does wear off after some time. The other issue, though, is that it causes pulmonary edema, which means fluid buildup in your lungs, which is where the coughing comes in. But that's how it would affect you typically, anyways. So yeah, these guys are, well, some of them have their eyes swollen pretty badly and are still trying to fight in that condition. So another case of men made of sterner stuff at the time. But now we actually get to talk a little bit about a German tank, and I think you've been looking forward to this one, judging from what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I've got a hate up for this tank.
I can see why. So, the tank in question that the Germans were using, the actual German design tank, is the A7V, this vehicle.
Yeah, the floppy Jerry. Where they took 2 years of a beating from the British tanks and saw how effective the design was and ignored everything about it and did something completely different.
There are some...
Germany in a nutshell.
Yeah, there is one good thing I can say about this tank, and that it was fast. But it's also a case where it kind of had issues anyways that hindered its off-road mobility. The biggest problem with it... Okay, so there's several problems with this tank. Another thing I should mention is the armor on this thing was actually, on paper, decent. It had 30 millimeters of armor, which at the time was actually pretty good. It's comparable to what German tanks in World War II would have had, in terms of if you just counted sheer thickness. Unfortunate, and by early war, I mean, so Panzer IIIs and stuff like that is what I'm comparing this to. Unfortunately, the armor was not heat-treated in any way whatsoever. So the actual effectiveness of this armor is considerably less than what it was actually supposed to, than what it actually could have been. And it's also was, well, with the armor at this time anyways, tank armor tended to be a little bit inconsistent because of just production issues.
Mm-hmm.
So there tended to usually be weak spots on the armor. So that's something worth noting. One of the other big issues is the sheer number of crew. Now, would you like to let everyone know how many crew was in this tank? Now, it did vary a little bit, but...
I believe this particular one had 12.
No. No. So, actually, the source I'm going to use is Military History Visualized, because he did a video on this and was pretty good. The minimum crew number was 16, although it could actually go up to as high as 26 assigned to this one single tank.
Oh boy, that was, you'll have to forgive me. I have been partaking in a little bit of the devil's lettuce this evening.
That's okay, no worries.
So the brain is a little bit fuzzy, but the funny thing is I have stood next to 2 replicas of Mephisto.
Okay.
I have stood next to the one replica in Ottawa, Canada, at the War Museum there, and the other one in Munster, Germany, at the Panzer Tank Museum.
All right.
And it is impressively freaking tall. Like, it's no wonder this thing fell over at the slightest sign of a hill.
Yeah, that's something else I was going to bring up. This tank is taller than it is wide, which led to some, shall we say, interesting characteristics. By the way, this is a picture of one of the tank's crew on the third picture there. But yeah, by the way, the reason why the crew was so massive is because they had jobs like, they had dedicated carrier pigeon holders. So it wouldn't be double duty, it's a guy would be dedicated to that role. You had dedicated runners, whose only job was to act as runners for these tanks. You had a dedicated commander for operating the gun. So you had a gunner, a loader, and a mini tank commander, I guess, for just the main gun. Pretty sure all the machine guns had a secondary loader position as well. To be fair, with the belt-fed design, you do kind of usually actually want a loader for that, but...
especially during that era, because those they didn't have disintegrating link.
Yeah, they had to use cloth, and it tended to jam up if you only had one person operating it, but yeah. So that's why they had so many crew, often. But about the flipping over, that is absolutely a thing. I actually have 2 photos of these things having flipped over. The first one, I'm not even sure what flipped it over, but turns out having a whole bunch of crew and having a tank that is taller than wide tends to do bad things to its center of gravity.
Yeah. The French discovered this too really early on in the war, thank Christ, and they steered away from this design, especially towards the later war. But yeah, these taller designs trying to angle the armor so sharply just didn't tend to end well.
Nope, no it did not. So yeah, the A7V had issues. Oh, and also, by the way, they only ever produced 20 of these things if you don't count the prototypes. Of these, all but one of the main line were male tanks. There was one single female tank which just replaced the main gun with 2 additional machine guns, so...
Yeah, and the one survivor is allegedly somewhere in Russia.
I thought the survivor was captured by the Australians, if I remember correctly.
Let me just see here. Let me just bring the article back up.
There might be, maybe there's a second one alleged in Russia. Who knows? Let's check. But yeah, the Germans never made very many A7Vs at all, so they were a very rare tank.
Trying to see who captured this. Okay, scrapped. Okay, so...
Okay, yeah, it says here on the that the one surviving is Mephisto at the Australian War Museum, but this is Wikipedia, so feel free to take it with a grain of salt. But
yeah, maybe it is that one. But there was another one, or was it the? Or am I thinking of the Char 2C?
Yeah, I think you're talking about the Char 2C. Because that's alleged to be possibly in Russia. We don't know for sure.
Mm-hmm. Because I know, again, a little bit buzzed here, but
That's okay.
yeah, that one was captured during the Second World War and then disappeared. Sorry.
Old Man Nixon says Russia was out of the war before the A-70. Well, that is true. On the other hand, and the reason why I think he might have thought this is, during World War II, the Germans actually started taking a lot of tanks out of museums for the Battle of Berlin and started putting them out into the city to fight. Like, I'm pretty sure they had Mark Vs that they were trying to use to fight the Russians off.
Yeah, at that point, they were literally throwing everything at the wall, including children.
They were throwing museum exhibits at the Russians. They were absolutely throwing children at the Russians, yes. And they were throwing pensioners at the Russians. Although, to be fair, by the end of the war, I know for a fact in the British case, by World War I, they were starting to use pensioners as rear line troops, so to free up younger men for the front lines.
Yeah. Especially when you tend to lose, a million men a battle.
Yeah, I know for a fact also, correct me if I'm wrong, but also the Germans were also lowering the age at which they were drafting soldiers into the military by 1918. I believe I read somewhere that they were drafting 15-year-olds in by the end of the war.
Again, wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of accounts of that across the board with many of the armies. Like, a lot of it tends to get swept under the rug, especially during World War I there, because fucking forgive me here, but like there was the huge propaganda effort. That was the first time like mass propaganda was used. So
I think if I remember correctly, the youngest soldier in World War I was a Serbian boy, but he wasn't drafted. He volunteered because the Austro-Hungarians had come to his village and killed his family off. So basically, the army was the only place left he had to turn to.
I think I'm aware of the story you're telling there too. I think I read an article there on it. So.
Yeah, I did a video on it myself. The kid was, I think, 8 years old when the war started, and he joined up in the first year and survived the war. And actually, in fact, was able to live a full life after. So
it basically was a ammunition runner, wasn't he, for them?
He was part of an artillery crew, if I remember correctly. Though the work was still dangerous, and he did get wounded at least a few times.
I'd imagine so. Like those old cannons were rather large.
Yeah. Old Man says draft age was 14 to 65 at the end. I could definitely believe it for some nations because, again, the casualty rates were staggering, and especially... Actually,
they were...
I actually have the perfect way to summarize just how bad the casualty rates were. So the grand total of percentage-wise casualty rates just serving in any of the militaries that were directly involved in the war was 56% casualty rate. Now, to put into perspective how bad this is, let's compare it to Japanese kamikaze pilots during World War II. The casualty rates for Japanese kamikaze pilots in World War II was 52%. Meaning that merely being in one of the armed forces that took part in World War I gave you a higher casualty rate than being a Japanese kamikaze pilot in World War II. Now, granted, being casualties, this is including guys that are wounded or captured and what have you. And, well, let's be honest, there weren't exactly a whole lot of wounded or captured kamikaze pilots. But the fact still stands.
The fact still stands that you're out of the battle.
Yeah.
Like, if you're a casualty, you're out of the battle.
Yeah. By the way, the reason why, although there is a reason for the surprisingly low casualty rates for the Japanese kamikaze pilots by comparison, it's because with Japan suffering fuel shortages at the end of World War II and with them preparing for the battle for Japan itself, they were holding a lot of the kamikaze pilots in reserve.
Yeah, they were also preparing to put them in dive suits and basically stuff them into essentially a pressurized, what is it there?
The Kaiten...
tube.
The Kaiten manned torpedoes, or... Kaiten might have actually been the suicide boats, which, yeah, the Japanese were using surface boats as well as submarines for kamikaze attacks.
Yeah, they were, again, another nation throwing everything at it.
And some of the stuff, some of the stories about the kamikaze submarines are... Well, there's a video from a guy named Draken that did a real good in-depth look at it, and some of the stuff that was wrong with those, even for a weapon where the operator is supposed to self-delete, this is some pretty harrowing stuff. Like, apparently the fuel in some cases was apparently similar to okay, so it was apparently similar to what the Germans used for their rocket planes in World War II, so similar to T-Stoff.
And it would melt basically the skin and flesh off your bones.
And the bones, too, from what I understand.
Yeah.
Basically, and the problem is the fuel container for this stuff tended to leak into the crew compartment. So, yeah, not a good way to go. They also, apparently, a lot of them would fail. Even the ones that didn't use that would fail quite frequently, and so they had a self-destruct button in the case that it failed, so... Yeah. Anyways.
War is crazy shit.
Indeed it is. Especially when you're talking about a nation that is completely desperate.
Yeah.
That
tends to breed weird behavior.
Indeed. Alright, so back...
I imagine I know where you're going with the, where your worst tank is, though. I imagine I know where that's going.
You do you?
I've got a pretty good guess. It's everyone's favorite tank to hate on from World War I.
Okay. I think you probably guess which nation at least. It's French design.
I do love French tanks. As much as we love to meme on the French,
yes,
they're actually impressive fighters.
They are. This tank, however, well, why don't you just go ahead and guess? See if we're right.
The Char-2C.
No.
Oh.
Nope. This one is way worse.
Oh boy.
This one is way worse. We're going to see why it's way worse. This is a tank that I think has flown under the radar because even when you see depictions of French tanks from World War I and of more obscure tanks, this one tends to get not mentioned because I suspect it's because it's that god-awful. Old Man Nixon says, no, it says the Saint Chamond. No, not the Saint Chamond either. Okay, I'm actually gonna go ahead and let you guys in on what it is real quick. It is, in my opinion, the worst tank ever to be used in World War I. There we go. There's the photos. It is this... Oh, apparently I can only upload 10 at a time. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of talk about this tank. So I'm going to go here. It is this tank here, once it's fully loaded.
The Schneider.
The Schneider. Do you want me to go through what is wrong with this design? So, first of all, let's talk about the problems with this tank. You know how the Mark V, I'm going to be getting to that too, but the Mark V had issues where the ventilation system on the Mark V was much worse than the Mark IV because they had beefed up the engine.
Yeah.
So the Schneider starts with a carbon monoxide problem, where apparently the crew could only safely operate the tank for a single hour. Off to the flying start. The interior of the tank was notoriously was actually quite cramped, even by the standards of the day. So, one of the images you'll see is of the view of from the back of the tank inside to what's supposed to be the front. Mm-hmm. That front is supposed to hold 4 guys: the driver, the gunner, the loader, and the tank commander.
Holy shit!
The 2 guys that are side gunners are in such narrow quarters that they have to constantly be crouched at all times to operate the guns. Because, at least at front, you can stand up kind of okay-ish, but in the rear you can't really do that. Another picture there shows up front what the crew compartment looked like when the crew was actually in it there. And then there's the layout for the main gun. Sneeko says, isn't that the one with the electric drive? I think you might be thinking of the Saint-Chamond. I know the Saint-Chamond had a special drive that made it faster than most tanks of the war, which was one of the few good things I'll say about the Saint-Chamond, but we'll get to that later. You'll notice that the gun, it only has one single gun. Now, it is a 75, but it's been sawed down to such a degree. Do you want to guess the muzzle velocity of this gun?
250 meters per second.
200 meters per second.
You might as well just get out and throw the round by hand.
I've actually checked just to make sure, and from what I've seen, this gun, there are airsoft rifles that can match the muzzle velocity of this gun.
I actually have an air rifle that can match the velocity of this gun.
I mean, now granted again, this is at a time where muzzle velocity isn't quite the big issue that it is in, say, a modern tank. For example, your typical M1 Abrams, if I remember correctly, has a muzzle velocity of 1,400 meters a second. And that's technically considered on the slow end, but, well, with depleted uranium, it kind of evens out the difference there. But the point is, even though it doesn't matter that much, when you're talking about a shell that is traveling slow enough that someone could feasibly dodge it like they're Neo from the Matrix, that's probably a bit of a problem.
Well, it's a good thing they didn't have smartphones or, Snapchat back then, because, guys would be just trying to do that.
Yes. So, on that subject, but you may be also wondering why the gun is mounted the way it is, because it's not actually mounted in the front. And it's not even mounted to be able to shoot straight from the side either. It is mounted in this weird angle that has a 60-degree firing arc.
Kind of reminds me of the Lee.
Oh, but it gets worse. So, for this, they had to develop a special apparatus so the tank commander could tell what the gunner could and could not shoot at. Unfortunately, that particular apparatus never really worked in battlefield conditions. So the tank commander can't even tell what the gunner can actually shoot at any given time. Which is kind of a big deal when he also has to issue orders to the driver to get the tank to turn to be able to get in a position where it can actually shoot at stuff.
I could see where that would be a problem, having a gunner you can't communicate with, driver you can't communicate with, and
at least your crew is right next to you, so they can maybe tell you as in some way when they're in a position to actually shoot. But you may be wondering, why not just put the gun in the front? Well, the reason is, if they put the gun in the front, then they couldn't have this massive beak at the front. You want to know why this tank has a massive beak at the front?
I'm assuming that's to flatten barbed wire so it doesn't get wrapped up in the track.
That is exactly what it is designed to do. Unfortunately, what it tends to, more often than not, actually accomplish is, in the next photos underneath, get the tank stuck. So they compromised the main weapon of this tank for a feature that doesn't even work as intended and instead causes more problems. Starting to see why I am not a fan of this tank.
I'm starting to see why, for sure. It almost looks like someone just took a bulldozer and kind of slapped some armor on it, like the old Bob Semple.
That's kind of what they did, because it is actually using, if I remember correctly, an agricultural track as its movement. And this was also something that the Saint Shaman tried as well, and led directly to problems with the Saint Shaman at the exact same time, but yeah, and I'll be getting to that real soon anyways. But I will say this, there is one decent thing I can say about this tank, and that is the fact that you could at least transport it via truck rather than have to use a railroad system. At least in theory. So, at a time when these tanks were moving as slow as they were, that's kind of a big deal. But, yeah. Also, though, apparently, though, the French didn't seem to think that this tank was a bad enough idea, so they decided to screw with it during its first debut into battle, which was the Nivelle Offensive. Now, the Nivelle Offensive is notorious for being the battle that went so poorly that the French army ended up mutinying against their own officers. But here's where they decided to mess with the Schneider even further. They decided, for whatever reason, to issue the crew extra fuel into spare fuel cans that were mounted externally.
That's an idea only so goddamn retarded it could have only come from an officer.
They then decided to, when these tanks would actually go over the top, they were to go in much more close formation than you probably should. Meaning that even if artillery aiming at one tank missed, it might hit another tank. And then, to top this all off, the general in charge of this whole attack, Robert Nivelle, was very lax with security. As such, the Germans knew well in advance where the French would be attacking, and they also knew that the French were going to be sending tanks. So they equipped their German infantry with K-bullets to deal with the tanks, which it turns out the K-bullet can actually punch right through the armor on the side of these things. And they also, of course, prepared the artillery to do its thing. And the results are pretty much exactly what you'd expect.
A decisive French defeat.
Yeah. So yeah, the French did end up continuing to use these tanks until about September of 1918, at least on the front lines, but by that point, these tanks were so bad that the French flat out did not want to use these tanks by the very end of the war, so they just used them as supply vehicles. A lot of these, by the way, they would have that front beak removed, which considerably improved off-road performance, it turns out.
Well, that's essentially a giant wedge and a brake.
Yeah. There is one other thing. Apparently this tank had spaced armor. Not really that much of an advantage, given the armor on its thinnest was 6mm, but still something, I guess. But you can, yeah, not exactly a good design.
No, there's nothing redeeming about this thing.
Huh?
Not a redeeming quality at all.
Nope. You know what? Since we're talking about French tanks, we might as well talk about another tank that a lot of people have been talking about that is generally considered not a good tank. And I will say this, it's not a good tank. Though it's not as bad as the Schneider. And that is the Saint Chamond. Are you familiar with this type?
I am. I believe this one is, I often refer to it as the French boat.
It was apparently originally designed as a poor copy of the Schneider. But being a poor copy of the Schneider, it actually performed better.
Yeah, this is exactly the one I was remembering.
But it's, okay, so yeah, as you can see here, what they've got is the massive French 75 field gun. Well, not a massive, but it's a really good gun. The French 75 field gun was often considered one of the best field guns of the entire war because it was fast, accurate, the recoil was minimal on it. It was a revolutionary piece of equipment. But what they have done here as a necessity is they actually took the wheels off of the carriage and they mounted the entire carriage of the gun into the tank. You can actually see the tail of the carriage in some of these pictures as well.
Yeah, I'm looking at the, I believe it's the third picture you've got there, and I can still see the artillery pinion.
Yeah. So I believe that they did that as a necessity, as it was somehow necessary for you to be able to traverse the gun from side to side, so that's what they did there. Unfortunately, doing it this way made the tank a lot longer than it should be, which led to, well, you'll see. But as you can tell, at least in this design, it's much more roomy than in the other one. But the big problem with the Saint-Chamond can be summed up in a few pictures. I happen to have 5 pictures that show the exact same problem. See what I mean?
Yep. Just gets hung up on everything.
Yeah.
Or it would bury its gun.
That too. This tank did not like uneven terrain at all. This was such a problem that apparently French tank crews didn't want to even train on this thing, and that led to issues there. So that should give you a hint of how much of an issue this was. That said, once you actually get onto comparatively more open terrain, like towards the very end of the war, once the occasional breakthrough does actually happen, and these tanks are able to find themselves on open ground rather than the actual combat conditions they were actually designed to fight in, they performed better, at least, because, say what you will, this tank was actually fast. It actually had a top speed of 8 miles an hour. It was one of the fastest tanks the French had, believe it or not.
The thing is that bothers me about this tank the most is the French were just so close on stumbling onto an idea that would have been just beyond revolutionary. If they had just gone one step further, they would have had the self-propelled gun.
Yep.
To follow the infantry. They were just so close, and then they just fell over themselves at the end.
Yeah. They actually... That's kind of how this thing was used when it was used successfully, ultimately, because, well, a 75 does do pretty interesting things to enemy fortifications when it gets a good shot on them.
Yeah,
so,
the French 75 was amazing. Oddly enough, so was the French 37, especially for cracking pillboxes.
Yep. It might not have been good against tanks, as was found out later on during World War II, but here it's not quite that big of an issue.
Yeah. Well, back then it was, you know, Top Gun for its period, but time you hit the Second World War, it's everything but from the First World War is pretty much obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
With the exception of, like, your Enfields and your Mausers.
Well, I know some of the, if we're talking artillery, I know some heavier guns were from World War I. Some of the heavier artillery pieces, like, if I remember correctly, one of the United States heavier guns from World War II was a model of 1918 155. That was pretty good.
Oh, more than likely.
Yeah. Old Man Nixon says they did Renault. Yeah, the Renault FT will be getting to that. Don't worry. So yeah, the Saint-Chamond and the Schneider are two of the worst tanks, although the Saint-Chamond is not as bad as the Schneider, but then again, is there anything that's as bad as the Schneider?
No, there is not.
Alright, so anyways, let's go ahead and get back to this story here. It's been a little bit of a deviation, I'll admit. So we had met our rivals at last. For the first time in history, tank was encountering tank. The 6-pounder gunners, crouching on the floor, their backs against the engine cover, loaded their guns expectantly. We still kept a zigzag course, threading the gaps between the lines of hastily dug trenches. Coming near the small protecting belt of wire, we turned left and right. The right gunner, peering through his narrow slit, made a sighting shot. The shell burst some distance beyond the leading enemy tank. No reply came. A second shot boomed out, landing just to the right. But again, no reply. Suddenly, against our steel wall, a hurricane of hail pattered, and the interior was filled with a myriad of sparks and flying splinters. Something rattled against the steel helmet of the driver sitting next to me, and my face was stung with minute fragments of steel. The crew flung themselves flat on the floor. The driver ducked his head and drove straight on. Above the roar of the engine could be heard the scatado rat-tat-tat-tat of machine guns, and another furious jet of bullets sprayed our steel side, the splinters clanging viciously against the engine cover. The Jerry tank had treated us to a broadside of armored-piercing bullets. Old Man says every tank mentioned was from a different manufacturer. That is true, and that's also part of the reason why the Saint-Chamond was a poor copy of the Schneider, because it was made by people that didn't have the rights to the blueprints to the Schneider, so they decided, well, here's what we've heard the thing is supposed to be, so let's make it based on that, on what we've heard. So, yeah, it's a case of bureaucracy and business sabotage there in that story, so... Anyways, but getting back to this. Taking advantage of a dip in the ground, we got beyond range, and then turning, we maneuvered to get the left gunner onto the moving target. Owing to our gas casualties, the gunner was working single-handed with it, and his right eye being too swollen, he aimed with the left. In addition, as the ground was heavily scarred with shell holes, we kept going up and down like a ship in heavy sea, making accurate shooting difficult. His first shot fell some 30 yards in front, and the next went beyond. Nearing the village of Kachi, I saw to my astonishment that the two female tanks were slowly limping away to the rear. They had both been hit by shells almost immediately on their arrival, and they had great holes in their sides, as their Lewis guns were useless against the heavy armor plate of the enemy, and their gaping sides no longer afforded them any defense against machine gun bullets. They had nothing to do but withdraw from action. We were still lucky enough to dodge the bullets the enemy shelling, although the twisting and turning once or twice almost brought us on top of our own trenches. Whilst we were ranging on the leading German tank, our own infantry were standing in their trenches watching the duel with tense interest, like spectators in the pit of a theater. Whilst we were ranging on the leading German tank, our own infantry were... Looking down on one occasion, I saw to my horror that we were going straight down into a trench of full of men who, huddled together, were yelling at the tops of their voices to attract our attention. A quick signal to the gearsman seated in the rear of the tank, and we turned swiftly, avoiding catastrophe by a second. Another raking broadside of armored-piercing bullets gave us our first casualty, a bullet passing through the fleshy part of both legs of the Lewis gunner at the rear after piercing the side of the tank. We had no time to put on more than a temporary dressing, and he lay on the floor, bleeding and groaning, while the 6-pounder boomed over his head. The empty shell casings clattered all around him. The roar of our engine, the nerve-wracking rat-tat-tat of our machine guns blazing at the Boche infantry, and the thunderous boom of the 6-pounders, all bottled up in that narrow space, filled our ears with tumult. Added to this, we were half stifled by the fumes of petrol and cordite. Again we turned and proceeded at a slower pace. The left gunner, registering carefully, hit the ground right in front of the Jerry tank. I took a risk and stopped the tank for a moment. The pause was justified. A carefully aimed shot hit the turret of the German tank, bringing it to a standstill. Another roar and yet another white puff at the front of the tank detonated a second hit. Peering through with swollen eyes through his narrow slit, the elated gunner shouted words of triumph that were drowned by the roaring of the engine. Then once more, with great deliberation, he aimed and hit for a third time. Through a loophole, I saw that the tank heel over to one side, and then a door opened and out ran the crew. We knocked the monster out. Quickly, I signed the machine gunner, and he poured volley after volley into the retreating figures. My nearest enemy being now out of action, I turned to look at the other two, who were coming forward slowly. As the German infantry were still advancing, the 6-pounder gunner sent round after round of case shot into their direction, which, scattering like the charge of a shotgun, spread havoc in their ranks. Now, I thought, we shall not last very long. The two great tanks were creeping forward relentlessly. If they both concentrated their fire on us at once, we would be finished. We sprinkled the neighborhood with one of them with a few sighting shots, when, to my intense joy and amazement, I saw it go slowly backwards. Its companion did likewise, and in a few minutes they both had disappeared from sight, leaving our tank the sole possessor of the field. This situation, however gratifying, soon displayed numerous disadvantages. We were now the only thing above ground, and naturally, the German artillery made savage efforts to wipe us off the map. Up and down we went, followed by a trail of bursting shells. I was afraid that at any moment a shell would penetrate the roof and set the petrol alight, making the tank a roaring furnace before we could escape. Then I saw an aeroplane flying overhead, not more than 100 feet up. A great black cross was under each wing, and it crossed over us as I could see the figures of the pilot and the observer, when something round and black dropped from it. I watched it for a fraction of a second, horrified. The front of the tank suddenly bound up into the air, and the tank seemed to stand on end. Everything shook, rattled, and jarred. We fell back to earth with a crash, and then continued on our journey unhurt. Our steel walls had held nobly, but how much more would they endure? So yeah, I think fair bit. There's a bit more to the story, which I will of course continue on. But so yeah, that was a bit there of the first tank-on-tank fight. Any more thoughts from your end?
That's insane. That the fact that you've got to sit there and actually hit the tank multiple times with these, like in these old beasts. Like nowadays, even with like explosive reactive armor, space chop armor, whoever gets the first shot off wins in a tank-on-tank fight. Like,
I think what it might have been. I think what it might have saved that German, or what took it so long for the German tank to be taken out, was because of how big the tank is. It increases the chance that you might not actually hit anything important. I think
that is true. There's a lot of empty space in those A7s.
Yeah, and I will say this. Believe it or not, they didn't actually knock out that particular tank, because from what I've read, the crew for that tank, what was left of the crew, returned and were able to actually get the tank started up and back running, and then they tried to retreat it back to their own lines. Apparently it broke down again later on, but the point is, 3 hits and it still didn't quite take the tank out.
That would be an intense situation. Like I couldn't even imagine. Like just thinking about it just gets my adrenaline up. Like,
yeah,
it's almost like that last scene there in Fury when they're facing off against the Taggart, and he's just hoping to get that second shot into its tail.
Mm-hmm.
Like that kind of a close-in knife fight would be just like all the times I've been in a tank, it's more or less been unopposed. So I've got no actual frame of reference.
But yeah, that is it is quite interesting how it was back in the day, definitely. Old Man says, wooden mock-ups and paper tank. It's crazy that the French arms industry and bureaucrats were still dysfunctional 20 years later. Well, you have to remember, a lot of the guys that were in charge during World War I were also still in charge during World War II. That's something to keep in mind, at least as far as the people in charge of the industry. Right? I know it was for a fact with the military, especially.
Yeah, and they didn't really want to listen to a lot of the guys who were there on the front lines who came up through the ranks. Like if they had listened to guys like de Gaulle and whatnot to begin with, the Maginot Line wouldn't even have been a thing.
Yeah, that was a bit of a mishap, the Maginot Line. Though, I will say this, there is a reason also why. It's because, believe it or not, with the way the war went, it turns out that the war went so poorly for France in terms of casualty rates. You have to remember, France suffered, had the 3rd highest casualty rate of any of the major nations of World War I. The casualty rate for the French army was 73%. It was the 3rd highest. So, because of this, a direct result was that it turns out that having such high casualty rates means that war widows end up becoming a significant part of the voting bloc. So that ended up meaning... And there was also, to be fair, there was cases of corruption and scandal within the French military that led to a lot of people not trusting the military. There's actually a movie that was made in the 50s about one particularly notorious case, which was actually, it's based off of a book, but the book is loosely based off of a true story, where the French apparently executed some guys for cowardice, even though the conditions were so bad that no one really thought that it was a reasonable course of action. Basically, I seem to be getting... Oh, never mind. Basically, the case was that it was such a pointless fight that the French soldiers in question were refusing to leave the trenches, and later on, the courts determined that years later that the troops were actually to try to leave the trenches under those conditions would have been more than would have been unreasonable to expect. So the soldiers got commuted, their families got pensions, and also were rewarded each 1 franc as well, in addition to the pensions, which is part of the reason why this whole scandal became so notorious.
That's a big old slap in the face.
Yeah. Oh, and add insult to injury, the 3 guys that they executed were supposed to be commuted, but the orders to commute them from their death sentence arrived about an hour after the execution.
That also doesn't surprise me, given the military.
So yeah,
always $1 late and a day short and $1 late.
Yeah, needless to say, people were not happy about that, and that's part of the reason why people in France didn't really trust the French military. Anyways,
yeah.
It also, I think, led to a lot of budget cuts for the French military, hence why it had some of the problems it did during World War II.
Yeah, the French military did suffer from a whole heaping load of problems, basically anywhere post-1918 to...
The thing is, it should have actually performed much better than it did, because, well, the soldiers themselves were veterans. They had... Once the French industry started kicking up, they did actually start producing some decent-ish, some actually pretty good tanks like the Samoa S-35 and the Char B-1, although the main French tanks were still those tiny 2-man tanks with the same gun as the Renault FT. Anyways.
Yeah.
So oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry. I was just adjusting.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and continue on. And continue on with the story here so we can get through what's left of it. Our steel walls had held nobly, but how much more would they endure? A few minutes later, as we were turning, the driver failed to notice that we were on the edge of a steep shell hole, and down we went with a crash, so suddenly that one of the gunners, taken unawares, fell forward on top of me. The driver, in order to right the tank, jerked open the throttle to its fullest extent. We snorted up the opposite lip of the crater at full speed. But when just about to clamber over the edge, the engine stopped. Our nose was pointing heavenwards, a lovely stationary target for the Boche artillery. A deadly silence ensued. After the intolerable racket of the past few hours, it seemed to us uncanny. Now we could hear the whining of the shells and the vicious crump as they exploded near at hand. Fear entered our hearts, and we were inclined at such a steep angle that we found it impossible to crank up the engine again. Every second we expected a giant shell through the top. Almost lying on their sides, the crew strained and heaved at the starting handle, but to no effect. Our nerves were on edge. There was but one thing left. To put the tank in reverse gear, release the reverse brake, and let it run backwards down the shell hole under its own weight. As we slid, and happily the engine began to sputter. Then, carefully nursing the throttle, the driver changed gear and we climbed out unhurt. What sweet music was the roar of the engine in our ears now! But the day was not yet over. As I peeped through the flap, I noticed the Boche infantry were forming up in some distance away, preparing for an attack. Then my heart bounded with joy, for away on the right I saw 7 small Whippets, the newest and fastest type of tank, racing into action. Alright, so now I'm going to have to talk about the Whippets here real quick. How familiar are you with the Whippet Tank?
I am vaguely familiar with the Whippet Tank. I believe it was a small little infantry tank, was it not? Basically just a little
It,
machine gun carrier.
this thing could be better described as more of an early cavalry tank. It was indeed a machine gun carrier. However, it was fast for the time. It had 8 miles an hour. Typically carried four machine guns, although it tended to be pretty cramped. So sometimes these tanks they deliberately went in with fewer crew than they could take, and with fewer machine guns, and the crew remaining just would swap the guns out from one position to another. But it was also one advantage of the Whippet was that it could be driven by a single person. The downside, there is a downside though, is that this tank had an issue with regards to that. So they tried to make it so that you could turn the tank without having to stop. The problem is, because of engines at this time, they set it up so one engine per track. So this tank had two engines. The problem is, it tended to, because the engines of the era and the fuel of the era, the engines tended to not like to run at the exact same speed, usually. And the driver tended to have some difficulty in controlling just how fast or slow they were going, which meant that the tank, if you tried to turn it the way it was originally designed, would tend to turn very wildly and unpredictably. So usually what the driver had to do was stop the tank, lock one of the tracks, and turn that way. Problem is, with a tank this big and going this fast, the sudden stop and attempt to try to turn, if you were not very skilled, could actually cause you to lose a track doing that, which is a bit of a problem.
Yeah. Throwing track is never fun.
Nope.
Especially this type of track here. This is basically riveted link. This is next to impossible to repair in the field.
So yeah, the driver had to be very careful about how to turn the tank, but the trade-off is it was a fast tank, and the machine guns proved to be extremely effective against infantry. Not so much against tanks, obviously, but that's why you don't really want to use one of these against an enemy tank. But against infantry, well, we're about to actually see, because this is going to be a really good example of of what these things are capable of. All right, so I'll just start at the last sentence I read. Then my heart bounded with joy, for away on the right I saw 7 small whippets, the newest and fastest type of tank, racing into action. They came on 10 to 15 miles an hour, heading straight for the German infantry. I could see the latter scattering in all directions. The whippets plunged into the midst of them, ran over them, spitting fire into their retreating ranks. Their work was soon over. They had nipped an attack in the bud, but only 3, their tracks dripping with blood, came back out of the 7. The other 4 were left burning out there in the front. Their crews could not hope to be made prisoners after such slaughter. So from what I've read from this particular engagement that he's describing, the Whippets were able to catch out in the open 2 full German battalions and had managed to kill something like 450 of them right there.
Yeah, I can see why they probably wouldn't be taken prisoner.
Yeah, this is also, by the way, I think this is still during the time before the Geneva Convention actually had rules on treating POWs.
That is correct. There was like several Geneva Conventions, I believe 7 in total.
Yeah. So this was a case where executing prisoners wasn't actually a war crime because it wasn't made illegal yet. So
but war crimes are the best crimes.
So yeah. Which is why you really did not want to be a sniper or a flamethrower operator during the war.
Yeah, that is true. You also didn't really want to be a flamethrower operator because you were the biggest target on the battlefield.
Yeah. Another one I know that really, in the case of Germans, that if you were captured with, that you would never expect any mercy with. If you were a German soldier and you were captured with one of the sawtooth bayonets, that was basically a death sentence for you, from what I understand.
That is correct. Every older veteran story I've remembered, I'm not sure how old you are, Ace, but I'm near 40.
Mm.
So I've still had the honor of actually talking with a few older World War One vets when I was younger, and they told me that yeah, taking prisoners really wasn't much of a thing. Like, neither side really liked to take prisoners.
Mm. All right, so let's go ahead and carry on. Then, near Villebretonneau, about 1,000 yards away, appeared a fourth tank. The left gunner opened fire immediately, and a minute later a reply came sharp and swift. 3 shells hitting the ground alongside us. Pursuing the same tactics, we increased our speed and then turned. We heard a tremendous crack, and the tank continued to turn round in a circle. "What the hell are you doing?" I roared at the driver in exasperation. He looked at me in bewilderment and made another effort, but still we turned round and round. Peeping out, I saw one caterpillar track doubled high in the air. We had been hit by the Boche artillery at last. 2 of the track plates had been blown clear away. I decided to quit. The engine stopped. Defiantly, we blazed away the last of our few rounds at the slopes near Villebretonneau, and then crept gingerly out of the tank, the wounded man riding on the back of a comrade. We made for the nearest trench when rat-a-tat-a-tat, and the air became alive with bullets. We flopped quickly to the ground, waiting breathlessly while bullets threw up in the dirt a few feet away. Then shooting ceased, and we got up again and ran swiftly forward. By a miracle, nothing touched us, and we reached the parapet of a trench. Our faces were black with grime and smoke, and our eyes bloodshot. The astonished infantrymen gazed up at us, open-mouthed, as if we were apparitions from a ghostly land. "Take your bayonets out of the way," we yelled, and we stumbled down into the trench. So yeah, that was from one F. Mitchell, who had enlisted in September of 1914, and was the tank commander of, well, the first tank to shoot at another tank in human history.
First tank-on-tank fight. Right.
Yep. And like I said, he would have been commanding a Mark IV, which we've already had a look at.
Yeah. I bet you he never paid for another beer for the rest of his life.
Oh, I'm sure he didn't. But that does actually give me a good opportunity to talk about the next line of British tanks that they made, which is the Mark V series. I'm going to go ahead and include the first 2 picks here on their own. So these tanks were a significant upgrade from the Mark IVs, although they did have a problem. They had been lengthened in comparison to the Mark IV, so they could cross wider trenches. They were given a rear-facing machine gun, because it turns out that that was an area that Germans like to engage Mark IVs from, because, again, they could hit anything from the rear. But one of the big changes was the engine and the steering system. The Mark V could, in fact, be driven by one person. So you didn't have the gearsman necessary in that role anymore. Typically, the gearsman, one of them would become a rear gunner and the other would be a dedicated mechanic, from what I understand. So it would still be 8 crew, but that's how they would do it with that particular tank. So far, this sounds like a significant improvement, right? Oh, and by the way, the engine also got a massive boost. So they gave it a 150 horsepower engine, which is about 50 times more powerful than the Mark I's to Mark IV's. So it was a significantly more, it had better power to weight ratio. This is also, however, where the problem kicks in. They didn't improve the ventilation on this tank, so carbon monoxide had a nasty habit of building up. There aren't really cases of guys being killed by this, but there are definitely cases of guys passing out from this, which is obviously a problem. Now, they did try to improve it, but it, from what I understand, remained an issue throughout the war. But the Mark V's aren't as common because it turns out that there is a variant of the Mark V that became more common than the main tank. That being this guy, the Mark V Star, where they've lengthened the tank yet again, as you can see. They decided to also, by the way, give this tank a secondary role. You want to know what that role is?
I can't guess, to be honest with you.
Alright, so their plan was they were going to use all that extra space to turn this tank into an APC. Apparently they were at least in theory, capable of fitting 25 infantrymen into the tank in addition to the crew.
So you want to deliver 25 passed out infantrymen to the next German line to be just lined up and bayoneted?
Yeah, on that subject. It turns out that the ventilation system tends to be even worse when you add 25 more guys to it.
You don't say.
So, yeah. Also, by this point, the tank was made so long with the Mark V stars that they could actually track themselves when trying to turn just because of how lengthy the tank was. So this led to another improvement called the Mark V Star, where they redesigned the tracks. Now, those are typically more rare, but they did exist, and one of them actually is in a museum, and that's why I'm showing a picture of the interior of a Mark V Star here, showing the improvements to the controls for the driver.
Yep.
Much better than having two gearsmen.
Yes.
And then,
No, carry on.
And then after that, it was decided to move on to the next design, which was going to be a joint project between the British and the Americans, the Mark VIII Liberty, which used a British hull, but the engine was, of course, the American Liberty engine. How familiar are you with the Liberty engine?
I am not familiar with the Liberty engine. Most of my World War I tank knowledge is about the French tanks.
Well, the Liberty engine is actually a point of pride a little bit in the U.S., and for good reason. It was a very reliable, very adaptable engine. It saw use in tanks like the Mark VIII Liberty. It saw use in aircraft. It saw use in torpedo boats. There's even cases of aircraft in the opening stages of World War II still flying using the Mark VIII Liberty, which shows you, yes, and while by that point it was very much long in the tooth and obsolete, but the point still stands, it was a good engine that could be used. That
does speak to reliability.
Huh? Yes.
That does speak to reliability.
Yeah, so it was a very good engine. Unfortunately, in this case, the Mark VIII, well, the war ended before the Mark VIII could actually see frontline service. By this point, the tank was once again lengthened even still further to cause even bigger shell holes and wider trenches. It was to such a degree that they had to actually redesign the tracks because, well, if you're familiar with the problem with making a tank this wide or long is that doing so while keeping the width the way it is tends to mean that the tank turns much, much more slowly. It's kind of similar to the to issues with ship design. So if you make a ship extra long but very narrow, it tends to turn much more slowly there as well. Similar problem here. So they actually had to redesign the tracks to make the tank turn in a more reasonable manner. Problem is, doing this also tended to make it increase the pressure that it placed on the ground, which made it a little bit more susceptible to mud. Although, obviously, it appears that the British were more worried about making tanks that could cross wider shell holes and trenches. They did also design a dedicated APC tank-ish thing called the Mark IX, which was designed to be able to carry up to 50 infantrymen per vehicle. And that thing, they actually designed it so that there was a variant of it that they tested that was amphibious, of all things. They tested it on Armistice Day, and there is footage of that if you want to have a look at that.
That sounds interesting because if there's one thing the British know, it's how to make boats.
Yep. Let's have a look, see if I can actually find it. Just for the sake of it.
No problem. So it's just, it was funny there. Some of the pictures you posted of these tanks on their sides, especially like the A7V and some of the Mark tanks earlier there.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I was in Afghanistan, I actually ran into the same problem.
Tanks flipping?
With the mud.
Fair enough.
It was the sand there The top layer of it was just like talcum powder. It'd been raining for about a week straight.
Ooh.
So we were drifting around this village as we're doing a force of presence patrol. And then one by one, the tanks go up onto the road, which is basically raised up from where the ground is. And I'm the last tank in the column. Everyone's up on the road already. I get up, make my turn. The frickin' road gives out. And next thing you know, I'm on my side in the frickin' ditch. Brand new Leopard 2 on its side.
So I did actually find a link to the Mark 9. I'm going to have to look at it through this thing here. Here we go.
Okay.
So we can actually see what it looks like. Here we are. So yeah, this is footage of the Mark 9 going into testing. If I remember correctly, the Mark 9 had a single machine gun that was just where the tank commander and driver were.
Okay.
And this is what the standard version looks like with a few photos, and the actual amphibious footage starts at the 47, or no, the 43 second mark, so we'll go ahead and watch that real quick. So what they did is they put a couple of bulges, airtight bulges on the sides of it. Looks like they put some sort of bridge to help direct the tank as well on top.
Interesting that they still go with the exposed track tensioner.
I mean, I guess you could argue that at bare minimum, if the tank does lose a track, it might actually be easier to put it back on. Maybe?
Yeah, I suppose. Those ballast tanks are certainly interesting.
Oh, that reminds me, on the Mark 8. Believe it or not, the Mark 8 tank, actually, one of them starred in a movie. You want to know which movie?
By all means, I've 1917.
Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. A Mark 8 was modified with a fake turret, and it stood as a stand-in for a German tank.
You mean that one where he's punching Nazis on the back of that tank?
Yep, that's a Mark 8.
Huh, well, what do you know?
Yep.
I thought that was just something they actually just cobbled together.
Nope, well, kind of, but they used an actual tank for the base of it, at least.
Amazing.
So yeah, so we've covered most of the French tanks. There is one I'm going to go ahead and show for the sake of it, the French Super Heavy that everyone knows, the Char 2C.
Yes.
Honestly, I don't think it's that bad of a tank. It's...
You know what? It really isn't. And there's a lot to love about this tank. It was just a victim of
bad timing.
The worst timing in the world.
Bad timing and bureaucracy deliberately sabotaging its development and production.
Like, this thing is just... It's even beautiful to look at. It's got clean lines. It's a slick design. It's got a very defined field of fire. It's got the same setup as a modern tank. Like, yeah, she's a long boy. And it's a little excessive, but it's still very much just a beautiful machine.
There are a few features I do need to mention that do make this tank stand out for the time. First of all, every single Char 2C had a built-in radio, which at the time was a big deal. Heck, it was a big deal even in World War II as far as the French military is concerned because, well, they didn't always put radios in all their designs. I mean, the Char B1 had radios, but most of the French tanks during World War II did not. The Char 2C did have a radio. The armor was 45 millimeters thick, which was pretty good for the time. And also, you want to know one of the special features about the cupola?
Is it rotated?
Yes, it rotates very fast, specifically to make it so that you could see pretty much easily out of it. There's actually some footage of this in action, although it's got the critical pass watermark, so sorry about that, but it does show you what I'm talking about, so there we go. Timestamp, well, you should actually see the cupola spinning pretty rapidly, and that was a pretty useful feature from what I understand, although a complex one, most certainly.
Yeah, it was revolutionary. On top of that, the even though it was a chopped down 105 millimeter gun, like the the power of it was just enough to take out anything in its path.
Mm-hmm. So
its power to Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. A legitimately good tank, I think we can most agree. 69 tons, which is about the weight of it's similar to the weight of an M1A2 Sherman these days, but for World War I, that is massive.
Yeah, this falls into this super heavy range, I believe, for World War One.
Yep.
And is still the largest operational tank ever.
Yeah, in terms of sheer dimensions, you are absolutely correct.
Yeah, she's a tall boy.
Mm-hmm. So that covers the French tanks, and I did already cover the A7B, but there is one additional tank that I do need to cover from the Germans because they tried to make their own super heavy. This bad boy, the K-Wagen. Two were mostly finished by the time the war ended, and there they are in the factory. Mm-hmm. Had they actually been finished, they would have been 120 tons in weight, equipped with 4 77mm cannons and side sponsons, plus a whole bunch of machine guns. That said, there are a few issues with this tank design. Want to guess how much armor this thing has? It's 120 tons, so you'd figure it has to have some decent armor, right?
I'm going to guess in the range of probably 30 to 40 millimeters.
30 millimeters.
That stands to about reason, given that how wide this thing is. Even though, again, I don't understand why they just wouldn't extend those tracks if you're going to build it this wide.
I'm thinking the reason that they build the sponsons like that and have them stick out is, well, if you're going to be shooting at mostly trenches, your guns are going to have to aim down. So if you build a turret on top of a tank that has a massive hull on it, the gun depression is going to be an issue.
Oh yeah, that for sure. No, but I'm more concerned about the track placement. This thing is top heavy.
Yeah.
To the nth degree.
Yep. Also, it had a expected crew of 27 men.
Because of course it did.
Because the Germans didn't learn their lesson with the A7V, apparently.
Makes you wonder what happened, post 1918 there.
Mm. So that covers the German tanks. There are a few other countries I might as well pull up as well. I do have... which would you prefer, an American tank or an Italian tank?
Well, I already know what the American tank is going to look like, but...
what is it?
Let's look at if I'm not mistaken, it was pretty much like a box on tracks.
I'm not sure. Maybe? Well,
the Ram, correct?
No, this is different.
Oh, okay. But let's see the Italian tank.
Oh, okay. Let me exit this then. So yeah, the Italian tank. Believe it or not, the Italians were the first nation to ever get a super heavy tank into actual combat. And it is this thing, the Fiat 2000, which should not be confused with the Fiat 3000. The Fiat 3000 is an Italian copy of the Renault FT. Oh, shoot, I forgot the Renault FT. Oh, God. Okay, we'll have to go back to that. But anyways, this thing. So, yeah, this thing, if I remember correctly, it's a 65mm gun in the main turret there, plus, of course, 6 machine guns. This thing, now, it is light for super heavy tanks from the era. It's about 40 tons, but it is still considerably more heavier than anything else, aside from other super heavies from the time. This thing did... Huh?
Something about this almost just screams America. Just guns everywhere
I know, but it's an Italian design.
Yeah.
This thing, okay, so this thing did, in fact, they built 2 of these, I think, by the war's end. And these did actually see combat, but they didn't see combat in World War One. Instead, they were sent pretty much very shortly afterwards into North Africa to fight an insurgency there. And unfortunately, it turns out that sending super heavy tanks that are extremely slow in to conduct a counterinsurgency operation against guys that are using camels and horseback is not the best use of a tank of this design. And their performance was not that impressive specifically because of that.
No, something like this is meant just to fight a static fortification.
Yeah. So they ended up getting recalled, or one of the 2 ended up getting recalled anyways. But yeah, this is the first super heavy to ever actually see combat. And the Italians were the, so the Italians built the first super heavy to see combat. And also, while the Renault FT was the first tank finished to have a fully rotating turret, the Fiat 2000 was designed before the Renault FT, but because it's a super heavy and because of various other factors, it wasn't finished till after the Renault FT. So it's one of those cases where it can kind of claim some fame in that regard as well, although the Renault FT is understandably the more famous tank.
More famous.
Yeah. And on that subject, let's talk about the Renault FT, because I did kind of forget it for a little bit. But this does lead us to talking about the American tanks. American tank I was going to talk about later on anyways. A revolutionary piece of equipment. Most certainly. It's a simple 2-man crew tank, but fully rotating turret, and it is extremely... It does not have the weird... it does not have the weird quirks of the British Mark tanks, but... You did mention that driving these could be a little bit... they had a few quirks to them. You did mention that to me earlier. So would you be willing to elaborate by chance?
So, for one, you got to double clutch these things. And the first time I ever got into it, I had no idea how to even double clutch. And basically, you're trying to feather the brakes onto the tracks as it's going. So once you drop it into gear, like the only way you're turning it is just by actually applying a brake to the track. And you got to be careful to feather it so it actually doesn't stall out the engine.
Okay.
Because while this tank is extraordinarily reliable, trying to brake the engine to turn the tank is, well, it'll stall it out, and then you got to get out and actually crank it over to start it back up.
Yeah, and that is an issue on these because, well, like you said, you have to jump out, which in combat is not a good idea. The British Mark tanks, you could actually start them up while inside the tank, which was a... Yeah. Whereas these things, the crank is located on the rear, which is it's protected. It's covered by the tail there, so you have to lift the tail up, right?
Yes.
But yeah, it's the reason why this tank took off. Well, there's several reasons. Even though the French only really started getting these things into mass production into 1918, these quickly became the most produced tank of the war. Part of that, I think, is because the British kept modifying the Mark tanks, so it tended to limit how many of them that they produced, although they still produced a lot of Mark tanks. Whereas the French here seem to have made the real main difference, besides, of course, male and female variants, is that there were 2 designs of turrets, basically. So that meant that the French were able to produce a lot of these tanks. 2-man crew, plus, of course, the fact that the main gun is housed in a 360 rotating turret, means that this thing can engage targets where no matter the angle, whereas, of course, the British rhombus tanks, you have to turn to even aim the main guns. So, a very convenient and practical weapon system.
And the turret was remarkably easy to move.
Yep. And another big feature, once again with the Schneider, these tanks could be transported by truck, which was a very big deal, once again, back in those days, where these tanks were still going about 5 miles an hour, 4 to 5 at the most on roads. Being able to transport them via truck was a huge strategic advantage. And it also means the lightweight that it would be far easier to perform maintenance on these back behind the lines. So a comparatively easy to maintain, easy to transport, and easy to use tank. Very understandable why these took off as a design.
It was literally designed like for soldiers. There's nothing about this tank that is complicated.
Yeah. The only thing I can say, the closest thing to an actual con to this design is that it was not as capable of crossing trenches as the British tanks, but that's because the British tanks were specialized for crossing trenches and shell holes. From what I understand, this tank the limit was what, about 6 feet was the maximum width that it could cross?
About 1.2 to 1.5 meters, yeah.
So that was the one drawback, but that's still better than any of the other French tanks because, well, to be fair, the other French tanks were the Schneider and the Saint-Chamond, and, well, we've seen how well they can cross obstacles.
Well, if you think the French, put a little bit more thought into it, they would have put a loading ramp on the back of those Saint-Chamonds and get the Saint-Chamond stuck and then just up and over it with the FTs.
So, yeah. I mean, not really too much to really say about the Renault FT other than easily the best tank of the war for the reasons I have just stated here, pretty much. So, yeah, the French developed both the worst tank of World War I and the best. So, on that subject, let's talk about a tank that took the Renault FT idea and decided to simplify it. An American tank. Say hello to this guy, the Ford 3-ton. What they've done here is they have taken a Renault FT, basically, the Renault FT design, removed the turret, put the gun into a forward-facing casemate. It was a female. This tank is a female-only design, by the way, but they have given it more powerful engines, and it weighs less than half the amount of the Renault FT. So this. And it's also twice as fast. So this is a proper cavalry tank. It does, however, have issues. And, it does show some of the limitations that it and the Renault FT have when it comes to crossing obstacles like, well, shell holes. And here's a video. Go ahead and mute it because the music here is... Well, this video does not use particularly good music for what is shown here, but it does show... how the Ford 3-ton, and also some of the same issues that the Renault FT would have.
Okay. Yeah, I've got it on mute.
Okay. So at the, once you hit the, yeah, you saw that first bit there.
The flip.
Yeah, I could see the VA right now. We have no idea if your injuries are actually service-related. There's no way of knowing. I love, however, how both the driver and Mr. Ford are just snickering at the fact they flipped the tank upside down.
Yeah. I do believe this would be like... and then they're ramming into each other. Like,
yeah, that's another thing.
Zero visibility.
Well, and I think this was also a case where the tank... they are ramming into each other. There we go.
Yeah.
So yeah,
this is how baby tanks are made.
So yeah, this tank, believe it or not, had the war actually continued, this would have been one of the most produced tanks of the entire war. Though there is some interesting reasons for it. It's not necessarily because of how good the U.S. Army thought the tank actually was. Believe it or not, actually I'll go ahead and tell you once the video here ends.
Just fell into the hole.
Yep. That's also the problem that would happen with the Renault FT. So if the trench is too wide, the tank will just fall in and get stuck that way.
Oh, man. This video is exactly what I needed at the end of this day.
They're trying to figure out how to get it unstuck, and, well, I know how this ends.
This looks like I would almost consider this to be a tankette.
basically is, but this is before tankettes were really an idea, so...
Yeah.
It's basically like one of the Italian tankettes from World War II.
Yeah.
So they had to actually dig it and start tugging on it with a rope. To be fair, at 3 times... And it got stuck again!
Oh, Lord.
So yeah, that does highlight the issue with making a small tank and trying to traverse no man's land with it. But here's where the story gets interesting and bizarre. The U.S. Army, when they tested it, they thought it didn't meet their expectations. But then they decided to order 15,000 of these things anyways. Now, the war ended before they actually produced 15,000. They only produced 15, in fact. But the reason why they produced and were going to produce so many is because the U.S. Army wanted to use these to tow artillery pieces across no man's land. Do stuff like that. And if you're going to... And you know what? The tank, as light as the tank is, and with the comparatively good power-to-weight ratio, this is a design that probably could transport artillery across no man's land. Assuming it doesn't get stuck, of course.
Yeah, you know what? This thing probably is strong enough to haul out a Pac 105.
In fact, even though the French weren't really impressed with it, they placed another order for another 1,500, so they could do the exact same thing. So this tank might have actually, had the war continued, performed a pretty critical role, because one of the biggest problems towards the end of the war was once you had a breakthrough, was the follow-up, as in, how do you get all your artillery, ammunition for the artillery, and all the other supplies across a shell-cratered no man's land? Because horses and stuff like that are going to find it to be quite the challenge indeed. You've kind of already also destroyed all the roads and railroad systems. Those have to be built up, so what do you do in the meantime? Why not use something like this? It basically would have... I guess it would have basically performed the same role as a universal carrier from World War II in that regard. And those were pretty useful in that. So, yeah. So I've covered most of the nations, but there is one more, and it is one of those cases where I kind of have to cover it, or else people will say, yeah, you forgot this, and it is a bizarre design, so let's look at a Russian prototype.
Oh, God, the Tsar.
You know exactly what's coming.
Yeah. The Tsar tank. The tank's so ungodly heavy that they got 2 other vehicles stuck trying to get it unstuck.
It is another super... Yeah, it is another... Sorry.
110 tons?
Actually, from what I understand, the Tsar tank wasn't actually that heavy. It was only 45 tons, I think. But, yeah, from what I understand, it would still be considered a super heavy by World War I standards.
Yeah.
No, wait. It's 60 tons. It's 60 tons. My bad. Still a super heavy from the era.
Just the interesting thing is that tiny rear wheels were the drive wheels.
Mm-hmm. I mean, why you wouldn't use the front wheels for that is a mystery to me. But yeah,
I almost have to expect to see a Russian coming out wearing a 10-penny costume with a stovepipe hat, to ride this thing. It looks like one of those bicentennial bicycles on steroids.
You mean the penny farthing? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly what this looks like. Although, the thing is, with the penny farthings, they were designed so that it was the front wheels that you put all the power into, rather than the rear wheel.
Yeah. But historically, Russia has always done weird things with tanks.
That is true. Surprisingly, this tank wasn't actually... There are rumors that this tank was underpowered. The power-to-weight ratio on this thing wasn't actually that bad. It's just having it be a rear-wheel-driven tank, as weird as it sounds to say, with a tiny rear wheel is bound to cause problems.
just trying to overcome the sheer inertia of those two front wheels, plus the main body of that tank, would just turn that into a rototiller.
The big issue, of course, in this case was mud, because, well, that's how it
Russia.
got stuck. From what I understand, Russia in World War One mainly relied, of course, on armored cars. To be fair, the front lines in the Eastern Front tended to be a bit more mobile. The trenches weren't as well developed a system, although they did exist in plenty of. But also, well, once the stalemate set in 1915 on the Western Front, the British, the Belgians, and the French all had these armored cars that didn't really have a whole lot to do with, so hey, why not give them to the Russians? And so they did. Though, to be fair, the Russians also built some of their own armored cars. But yeah, Russia really had an obsession with armored cars during World War One.
Yeah, well, it is the steppe, and the Eastern Front tends to be more of a wide open plain.
Mm-hmm. So it makes sense, but yeah. All right, so, well, I think that covers pretty much all I was going to cover. You have anything you want to add to this?
Not particularly, no. You've actually hit all the main points, plus one I'd completely forgotten about.
Which one?
The Tsar tank.
Oh.
Like, I know that the term tank, at least in World War One of a time frame, is a rather nebulous term because it was such a new concept at the time. But at the same time, like this just the only thing about it that's tanky is the turrets.
Yeah, I still can't believe they thought it was a good idea to use wooden wheels on that as well. You know,
I am reasonably sure the Tsar had the guy who did this shot. Or at least the Soviets did as soon as they took over.
so there is, you know what? Actually, I am going to show one more thing just for if I can find a link to it here. Here we go. So, are you familiar with the Rat Tank? From
Are
World
we
War
talking
II?
World War II?
Yeah, from World War II. The Rat Tank from World War II.
Yeah, I am familiar with the concept.
And how ridiculous and absurd that thing was.
Yeah, that was literally the concept of like 1,000-ton land battleship
Well, yes.
with the same turrets as the Bismarck, I believe.
It was a turret from a cruiser, but that's, yeah. But that is, well, I've got something a little bit different here. Now, by the way, believe it or not, that wasn't the biggest thing that the Germans designed. They actually even designed a 1,500-ton vehicle as well, called the Monster, which was basically a self-propelled gun. But here's where things get interesting. What if I told you there is a World War I equivalent to the Rat Tank? And it's more ridiculous in every single way possible.
I would say I'm intrigued.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and send a link here. Here we go. Should be on the YouTube chat there, so I'll go ahead and copy it.
All right.
And I'll send it to you.
The Schumann Super Dreadnought.
Yes. This is an American design, and on paper only design, obviously, but this is the World War I equivalent to the Rat Tank.
Okay. This is just this is America.
Well, there is one thing about it that's not American, and we will be getting to that, don't worry. And it is one of the biggest problems with this tank. But you want to know how heavy it is?
5,000 tons.
5,000 tons. Now, it did use a 20,000 horsepower engine. Somehow, this person thinks that he could have gotten 100 miles an hour with it.
100 miles an hour. This frame would twist itself into pieces. This and the chains up front with those spoked wheels, you're gonna Yeah, this thing would rip itself apart the minute it got anything over walking speed.
Oh yeah, and do you want to know why those chains are there?
Mines.
No, it's even more. No, it's way. No, you. Okay, so guess what the main gun is on this. Don't look, just guess. Because you've got a 5,000-ton tank. What kind of gun do you put on it?
I'm gonna guess. Let's see. What was the biggest gun for dreadnoughts at that time?
I know there
12
was.
inch?
I know. Okay, so there was actually. Now that you mention it, the HMS Furious, the aircraft carrier, did launch with an 18-inch gun.
Okay. And you've said it like that, I'm gonna think it's even bigger. Uh, you know what? I'm stumped. I'm gonna guess bigger than 15 inches.
The answer is 0. This thing had no main gun. Instead, it was designed to crash into stuff to do with its sheer bulk and do damage that way. The chains, which were, by the way, supposed to be several tons in weight each, were designed to just drag along the ground and crush everything under the might of this tank. But it had no main gun of any sort. That's the un-American thing about this.
I am actually at a loss for words. Something about this just screams that this is almost like a precursor to Monster Truck Rally.
Yeah! It's the demolition derby of tanks.
That's amazing.
Believe it or not, there was actually a demolition derby before demolition derbies. Believe it or not, around this time, one of the things that you would actually see at fairs every now and then is if there were trains that were old and about to decommission.
Locomotive collisions.
Yes.
I have. There's a channel that I watch, History in the Dark.
Mm-hmm.
And he's done a few videos on that. That they always amuse me because like there was that one that blew up and like killed a bunch of people.
And then they made a song, and then someone made a musical song celebrating the time that the trains collided with each other and had an explosion. Which, yeah, that's an actual thing, by the way.
Yeah. That's the past was the worst.
Yeah, in some ways, but then in other ways, you have. I have to wonder if this guy Schumann was just trolling everyone.
You know what? Looking at this guy's picture, he's probably a shit poster.
He probably is. Oh, on that subject, guess how much armor this thing had?
Oh, probably, let's see, 5,000 tons. It's got to be about a foot thick.
It had no armor. It just relied on the structural integrity of the design itself, but it didn't actually have any dedicated armor. At all.
Wow, this thing would have been turned into Swiss cheese at the first sight by artillery.
Yeah. Like I said, this is the World War I equivalent to the Rat Tank, and it's even more ridiculous in every way imaginable.
Yeah. Definitely a shit post.
Imagine... I'm just as shocked at the logistic. Imagine if the U.S. actually built one of these and tried to use it in World War I. Imagine just trying to get the tank to France. You'd have to disassemble it. You'd practically need a factory once you got to France to reassemble the thing. And even then, trying to transport it, how are you going to transport it without it being either A, seen, or B, crushing absolutely everything in its path, which was kind of the whole point of the design in the first place.
Thing just clears out half of freaking Calais just as it on the way to the trenches. Fuck the French. Oh.
So, yeah. I don't think I need to say anything more about this.
No, it is amazing, ridiculous, and just mind-boggling, retarded all at the same time.
Exactly. Well, I think that's a good time to go ahead and leave. I actually think it almost sounded like you'd face palmed there when I told you about it not having a main gun at all.
Well, after you said, like, when you're saying that, I stopped scrolling through the article. Like, I stopped scrolling because I'm like, all right, I won't spoil it. I'm just looking at the picture, trying to guess. And boy, was I wrong.
All right. Well, I think now is a good time to go ahead and call it, because I think we've covered everything. We've had some good fun along the way as well in some of these.
Fantastic. But thanks for having me on, Ace. I really do appreciate it.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on. And
So
I think we'll go ahead and call it. Thank you again, once again, for being on. I hope everyone is having a good day.
thank you.
And hopefully you'll have you on again at some point soon as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
All right, have a good one.
You too. Peace.
All right. And we'll go ahead and call it, so the stream proper for everyone else watching. So, yeah, this has been Ace. Oh, he's already left. Okay.